Welcome to Business Outlook, a podcast by the Albuquerque Journal where we focus on 4 revolving themes: real estate, small business, emerging leaders, and technology. If you enjoy our podcasts, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us continue to bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. See the show notes for a discount on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading local news source.
Hi, I'm Allison Carpenter at the Albuquerque Journal. I want to thank our sponsor, C&M, so much for sponsoring today's small business podcast. Today I have Mark Truman with me, and we're going to be talking about his business, Magpie Games, where he makes TTRPGs, things like Dungeons and Dragons, but not exactly that, and card games. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
C&M is truly one college with infinite possibilities in tech and data sciences. C&M offers programs where everyone can learn about software, apps, or how to build websites. You can also choose from AI programs and machine learning, the Internet of Things, and so much more. C&M, one college, infinite possibilities, and a proud sponsor of the Albuquerque Journal's Business Outlook.
Hi, so if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, I'm Mark Truman. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Magpie Games, which is a tabletop role-playing and card game publishing company here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Got
you. If you wouldn't mind just explaining what that means.
Yeah, I have this thing where I go to parties or whatever. People are like, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "How long do you have?" Because if you tell people, "Oh, I work in I'm an engineer," people are like, "I don't really know what that means, but I agree." And when you tell people you're a tabletop role-playing game person, they ask a lot of questions. It's gotten easier for me to explain what a tabletop role-playing game is. Thank you, Stranger Things Season 3. But you probably are familiar with the most popular role-playing game ever created, Dungeons & Dragons. So if you think about Dungeons & Dragons, it's a bunch of nerds sitting around a table rolling dice about their elves and wizards and warriors and fighters, versus goblins and ogres, and you have some sense of it. What we do is very much in the same vein. I mean, our business traces its roots back to the 70s when D&D was first created. But what we do is create role-playing games about everything else, right? So, for example, we have a license for Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is a really popular cartoon. And in our role-playing game, you can take on the role of one of those kinds of heroes from the show. Or we even have games like Zombie World, which kind of rely on well-known zombie fiction. It's like playing out a zombie movie, but instead of watching the movie, you are the characters in the movie. And usually someone takes on the role of playing everything else in the world that's not you. It's not always the case. There are some games that don't have a game master, but it's really typical for games to have a game master or a dungeon master or a referee who tells the players what's going on, and then the players make choices. And then sometimes we roll dice or draw cards to resolve uncertainty, right? So if we say, I'm trying to get away from the zombies, you roll a die, or you did or you didn't, and then we follow things from there. And what's exciting about tabletop role-playing games is, unlike video games or board games or anything else, literally the possibilities are endless. You follow your character story wherever that story goes. So if you've ever had a moment in a video game where you've said, well, I wouldn't pick either of these dialogue options, I would say something completely different, that's what tabletop role-playing games are for.
Absolutely. So what got you into tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, man, that's have to rewind to Mark at age 12. So, we were talking before the podcast that almost every single person who plays role-playing games has someone in their life that kind of pushed them into it, right? That said hi, I'm a big brother or uncle or loved one or scoutmaster or whatever that showed you how to do it. Because it's kind of a lift, right? When I say, oh yeah, it's playing a movie, but you're the characters, you're like, that sounds cool. I still have no idea how to do that. And so when I was 12, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends, and I don't remember who it was, but there must have been one of my friends who was like, I will play Dungeons and Dragons with you. And
I will take on the immense task of GMing.
Yeah, right. Of doing all the prep work of building this world for you to play in. Yeah. And then pretty soon after that, I was like, that sounds really cool. I'll do that work, and became the dungeon master. And actually, ironically, I played a bunch in middle school. And then in high school, I ended up hanging out with some older kids who were playing Mage: The Awakening, which is a White Wolf game in which it's kind of like the Matrix. There's these wizards who are all hiding in society, and there's this technocracy, this like evil new world order that's like hunted them almost to extinction. It was the 90s. It's very nice, like katanas and trench coats 90s. And then I stopped for a long time in college. I didn't have time to play role-playing games. And I came home back to Albuquerque, and my brother was playing like 4 games a week. And I was like, okay, well, I would like to get to know you again. I haven't seen you really in a couple of years, so I'll play some role-playing games with you. And that ended up kind of getting me back into the world. And a couple of years later, my partner, Marissa, and I, she's my co-founder in Magpie, we decided we wanted to do some artistic project together because she's an artist, illustrator, and I'm a writer. And we said, okay, we'll do a comic book. And like a week into doing a comic book, we were like, God, this is so hard. Like, so let's do something easier. Spoiler, role-playing games are not easier, maybe harder. But we both really loved role-playing games. I mean, we met at a vampire LARP. Like we were pretending to be vampires when we met. And so we made our first role-playing game, and we put it up on Kickstarter in 2011, which was a new thing at the time. And if you're not familiar, Kickstarter is a crowdfunding program where you say, this is the project I want to do, and people come and they say, well, I will give you $20 to do that thing. And if not enough people care, then nobody gets charged. And if enough people care, then everybody gets charged. And we expected our first game, which was a Shakespearean role-playing game, in which you played Shakespearean actors arguing with their director about how the play should go. We thought it would, mostly get money from our friends and family. And none of our friends or family. I think one friend backed it. And Marissa was really upset. She's like, well, they don't believe in us. And I was like, no, this is so much better. Right? Because I remember being in a band in college where, your first show, all your friends and family come out. And then your second show, nobody comes out because everybody feels like they
already did it.
They already did it. I went to see them one time, right? So what I said is like, no, there's a fan base for this stuff. There's people out there who don't know us who wanted this thing. This is fantastic, right? And so over the next decade, we funded a lot of projects. Like we did everything from, like I said, stuff like Zombie World, where you're playing zombies, to games like Cartel, which is like kind of my personal passion project. And in 2021, we launched the Kickstarter for Avatar: Legends, the role-playing game, which, we're still kind of dumbfounded that we had that license and got that opportunity to work with Mike and Brian and Paramount to do it. But we raised $10 million. And, back in 2011, when we raised $5,000, we were like, oh my God, we've won the lottery, $5,000, because it wasn't our job. It was just a thing we were doing. And 10 years later, when we raised $10 million, we're like, oh God, $10 million. Like, how are we going to deliver books to 85,000 people? So, and all of that has happened here largely in New Mexico, right? This 10-year journey from this tiny project on Kickstarter to being one of the biggest role-playing game companies in the world. We're still kind of a little dumbfounded by it.
Fair. I was curious if you could take me kind of on the journey of doing this as a hobby to this is our job now. Like we have, I assume, an office or something. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so this is the Small Business Podcast, so I can give you the answer I kind of give everybody, and then we can talk about like the actual answer. So the first answer is that you gotta kind of take your art and get good at it, right? There's like a really famous Ira Glass quote where he talks about like the problem with making art is that your taste, the thing that makes you love art, is like super developed, right? Because you spent so much time working on it. And your skill sucks. Like you're really bad at making the art to start. And so you step up and you're like, I made this thing. And the part of you that's making the thing is like doing its best. It's trying so hard. And the part of you that critiques things is like, Mark, why do you suck so bad, right? And so the hard part is you have to push through that to the point where your skill level starts to catch up with your critique level. Spoiler, you probably never do. Like my critique level is always ahead of my ability to make things. But what happened was, we started making stuff and the projects got bigger and bigger, and we're really lucky. I mean, Kickstarter started the year before we funded our first project. Okay. And actually there are 5 different companies, us, Monty Cook Games, Freely Games, Modifius, and 1 or 2 others, who all started, they founded their companies within like 8 months of each other. Because we're the ones who got to use Kickstarter first. And we didn't have 17 projects in the pipeline already. We were like brand new, and all of us said independently, hey, let's use Kickstarter. And so Kickstarter became kind of the vehicle. We just did bigger and bigger projects until we did big enough projects that we could actually like leave our full-time jobs. And there was a really awkward time there where you're like making projects big enough to leave your full-time job, but you worry like, will I ever have another one? Like, is this safe?
Is this the last one?
Is this the last one? And then from this one, I'm going to quit my job and then never have another successful. So like, there's a lot of tension as you start to build your career as a professional artist of when am I hiring people? What are we doing to make sure we have the infrastructure? So like for us, Marissa and I did not take a paycheck from Magpie. Having founded the company in 2011, we didn't take a paycheck till 2019. Ooh. So it was 8 years of us reinvesting everything into the business. And we actually hired other people before we hired ourselves, right? Yeah. Like we had a guy the very first employee for the company was a guy who shipped books because he would come in every day, put the books in packages and send them out. The real answer is a little more complicated. I think when it comes to small businesses, I think that if you've ever owned a small business or worked at a small business, you understand that capitalization, whether you are capitalized correctly, meaning whether you have enough funds to do the things you want to do, is by far the number one problem. Like, it's hard because I think people hear that who aren't in small business and say, well, shouldn't you just be making money? Like every day you make money, right? And it's like, actually, no, most days Magpie Games makes no money. Like the cost of paying our rent, paying our employees, paying for everything we do is not equaled by the number of orders we get through our web store. And then people will say, well, then why are you in business? And it's like, well, sometimes we make a lot of money. So how do we keep our doors open between those times that we make a lot of money? Like that's really complicated and challenging. And there are a lot of moments within Magpie's history in which maybe a wiser, more thoughtful, less ambitious person would have said, no thanks, I'm done. I remember being at Gen Con in like 2014 and we literally like swiped our credit card to like, pay for the hotel room at the end of the con. And I remember thinking like, that's it. That's the last dollars we have for Magpie. But we have to be here. We have to promote this game. We have to get ready for the next Kickstarter. I really hope the next Kickstarter
does
well enough to keep us going, right? Yeah. And sometimes you just get stupid lucky. Like apparently, I bought a bunch of Bitcoin in like 2011, and because I thought it was a cool, weird thing, and through a series of events, like found the computer that the Bitcoin was on, and managed to sell some of the Bitcoin at exactly the right moment where we were able to pay this thing down for Magpie so that we could keep going. Like that's just luck. It's like a lottery ticket, right? So I think that the answer of being a professional artist involves kind of like working on your craft and building a business at the same time. Building the business side, if you own a small business, it's not linear. It's luck based. It's survivor bias. It's figuring out how to get through. And I think that's why when we were at the luncheon that you and I met at for Dream Spring, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, which is incredible. A New Mexico institution getting funding to small businesses is celebrating its 30th anniversary. I think that one of the themes I heard over and over was perseverance. That I'm sure as you talk to small businesses, it's just like you got to keep going.
But I do think, from what I've heard, it is very nonlinear, and I think that's really hard because that is not what you are shown when you are like promised the ambition of being like a small time entrepreneur. It's like it's all gains, baby, and it's like, it's a little wiggly.
Right? Yeah, like it's like this image we have in the Visa small business commercial of like you open your storefront and people come in and buy your donuts and it's just nothing but good things. And actually, all I can think about is, oh my God, if I had that many customers for the first day of my donut shop, we'd be totally screwed because I would be completely unprepared for the scale of business, right? And that's a lot of it is like, I had worked on some big projects before Avatar, but Avatar was 5 times bigger than the biggest RPG project to date, which was Lord of the Rings, the role-playing game, right? And so repeatedly through the process of doing it, I had to remind myself, it's not just that I haven't done this before. Literally, no one has done this before. How am I supposed to get it right if literally no one has done it before? I am the person I would hire to give advice about how to do this, right? So I think that's a part of it is your failures will always be, yours and you have to work through them and persevere. But your successes can be just as bad because they introduce so many new problems that you feel like you're drowning.
I guess the question at hand is, you had talked about these like peaks, right? When a game is released, that's like a big peak selling season, and you're trying to survive between these peaks. You had mentioned at the luncheon some like struggle with that when Legend of the Avatar game like came out. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So funding a project at $10 million, I think there are people who still think like I go to bed on like a pile of money every night, right? Like we raise so much money. Surely Mark has a bed composed entirely of $100 bills, in which I snuggle up, and like I guess the bills would be really dirty by this point because it's a couple of years ago. I have to wash them or something, but like I have a blanket of $1,000 bills or something. When in reality, we spent literally millions of dollars shipping books. Like it is so expensive to do a giant project. And, as we were coming through that process of shipping books, paying royalties, printing things, Magpie really did have a problem of all of our credit and infrastructure was built around projects that were like, maybe $300,000, maybe $500,000. And we didn't go from having a $300,000 project to an $800,000 project to a $2 million project. Yep. We went from, a $700,000 project to a $10 million project. And Magpie didn't have the financial infrastructure to weather the ups and downs of $10 million right away, right? Yeah. And so, it's so challenging to look at a company and say, well, you're so successful, like because all that person's seeing is the revenue, right? How could you possibly have any problems? And it's like, well, because that revenue is actually an indicator of scale. Like I can't imagine the scale that, Marvel works at now. Like you have to decide how many hundreds of millions of dollars will I spend on this movie is like, that's so much money. Like, how do you make that decision? And so I think they've had their greatest successes when they've built up to that. Like by the time they got to Endgame, they were like, we've done this 22 times. So we know broadly what to do. But they go into TV and now how many millions should you spend on TV? It's just different. Yeah. The revenue model is different. Everything's different. No wonder they struggled, right? Is because it's a completely different medium, completely different set of goals. One of the things Magpie's talking about internally is like, okay, well, role-playing games are great. We love them. We also love board games. And that's a space where like there's some really exciting innovations happening in the board game space around narrative and emergent storytelling and things we really love. Could we do a really awesome board game? Could we contribute something there artistically? Would that be a market we should go into? And I'm constantly thinking, is this Marvel going into TV? Like we know what we're doing on the role-playing game side. Do we really know board games? And more accurately, I think the question is, what will it take? What will it cost for us to really know board games? Right? And that's what you got to do, I think, as a company is figure out what will it take? How much will it cost to get to the next place we want to get to where that success lives? And to realize, as a small business owner, you want to get to some like perfect stability where you never need to worry again. And maybe that's an illusion.
Yeah, I don't know if that exists.
Right. Right. Because even if you're like, I just think about companies like Chipotle, right? Where it's like Chipotle's growth has been incredible. This company is amazing. And then they had if you're familiar with this, they had a really, really bad food safety, food poisoning outbreak, multiple stores having these issues. And like it was their very strength that they had local food that had caused that problem. And they had to rebuild their trust with all their customers. Like, there's no stasis, right? That's the beautiful part about small business ownership. No stasis. The terrible part about small business ownership, same thing, no stasis.
It's all improv all the time.
But you're always making it up, right? And if you're lucky, you get to a place where you have, some reliability so that you minimize the chaos to the new thing you're doing, the new project we're funding, the rest of your business becomes a place where you can really nurture your employees and nurture what you're doing together and build a culture that's really supportive, because there's always going to be these, you're a boat on the sea. There's always going to be winds and waves and storms. And how are you going to weather that?
So I did want to talk a little bit about your team. I feel like you run your business a little differently. You're like set up and structure and.
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's kind of ironic. I think on one hand, people probably look at us and think, okay, well, you guys are like every other role-playing game business. We're a little different first in the sense that, our industry has a long history of exploitation. Like, just to name it, like it's absolutely the case that, people often as owners and as capitalists have an attitude that anybody who works for them is lucky because they get to work in games. And sometimes that results in people getting paid, like $7 an hour, $8 an hour to work in a space that, you know, isn't super profitable. It's not like games. I'm not an investment banker, but like the transaction is really, really exploitative. Come work for me and you'll get a chance to do a thing you love, and I'll pay you the least I can get away with paying you.
And give you the most hours possible to burn you out immediately.
Yeah. And so, like, from just a purely business structure perspective, Magpie very, very much early on said, we don't want to be that kind of company. And so, yeah, how we handle wages is really different. We set a goal of what we want to pay people, that we think this is a fair wage for the work that we're doing. And very early on, we said, we're not able to fully pay that wage, right? We say, we think you should be paid $40,000 a year. Right now, we can only pay $32,000 a year. But we're gonna say within the company, this is our goal. And we're going to work towards it as a team. And I, as the CEO, am going to come to you every 6 months and tell you whether we're making progress towards that goal or not. And more importantly, everybody's salary is going to be public within the company, including mine. And no one, including me, is going to get a raise before everybody gets a raise. And for us, that's a reminder that every single one of these games is made with everybody's participation. The designer, the artist, the illustrator, the layout artist, the person who ships the game, the person who markets the game. No one person is the one who did the work. So either we're all in this together, or what are we doing? And I have been informed that is not how other companies run. To me, it's the only way for me to say I'm paying people fairly is for them to agree that they're getting paid fairly. And the only way we do that is to have a conversation about what fair pay looks like.
Absolutely. I also think when you have like such a small team, not derogatory, but like you're very tight knit and you all have to work together, because if like one of you isn't like doing something, I imagine it creates a lot of problems.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're a small team in the sense that we're not, you know, Chipotle, but we do have like 12 or 13 people. I mean, it's a big enough team that like there's politics, there's challenges. We're not 4 people anymore. But yes, I agree. And I think it's true I mean, I think you have to get really big before that's not the case. But if you have 10, 15, 20, even probably 30 people, if somebody doesn't really do their job, it's really obvious really fast, right? So yeah, we're all in this together. I mean, I would like to challenge other corporate leaders to say, you know, look, I know it's scary to put forward this idea that you're going to put everything out on the table and like make it public. But like my attitude is this. If I go into the lowest paid person's office and I tell them, Mark gets paid twice what you get paid, and that person says, well, that's not fair, I do just as much work as Mark, then that's a problem. Like that person has a perspective on the work that they do and how hard it is and what you do. And if you as the CEO can't justify your salary, then I think that says a lot about the work you do and how you communicate the work you do. And what I want is to always be able to go to my people and say, do you think we are doing the right thing? And sometimes they say no, and I say, cool, well, we're going to do it anyway, because I know things you don't know, or I see things you don't see, but I want their feedback. And I think that starts at a fundamental level with, what do people here get paid? And how do we make that decision? And if that decision is Mark just picks numbers out of a hat until I get people hired, I don't think that's good enough, right? And so I think that we are a small team, but I think that we're a big enough team that we've had to navigate this, and this is our solution to how we treat people in a way that really respects their understanding of their own job.
Absolutely. So to get into the games a little bit, how do you choose what you're making? How do you choose what happens next?
Oh, well, I'll tell you, that process has changed a lot. I think it used to be, we make things we think are interesting, and that's great until you realize that some of the things you think are interesting, no one else thinks is interesting. So, you know, I think as you go on in your career, you end up with like a Venn diagram, right? Of like stuff I'm interested in. That's one big circle. And then there's stuff other people are interested in, which is another circle. Hopefully has some overlap, right? And then finally, stuff that I can do, right? And when I say can do, I mean like I have the capacity, the funding, the skill, there's things that I wanted to do when I first started in role playing that I can now do, and things that I want to do in the future that I can't do yet, right? And acknowledging that's important. And hopefully when you line those 3 circles up, there's a large number of products that are in the middle of those 3 circles. To some degree, for you as an artist, you have to kind of settle yourself with the idea that there are going to be many, many, many ideas that lie outside of what is workable. For me, for example, for a very short amount of time, I was working on a game in which you played people at work at a paper or a magazine or something, kind of like Just Shoot Me, like the old TV show, but like a role playing game.
Yeah.
And then as I talked with people about it and worked on it, it's like nobody wants this game. This is not a game, right? And at the same time, I also realized that actually, if I wanted to make a workplace game, I'd already made it. It's called Cartel, in which you all work for the Sinaloa drug cartel, which doesn't sound like a workplace game, but actually when you play it means you're dealing with all these people at work. It's just that work has to be this melodramatic, like drug cartel where violence is always on the table. Mm-hmm. But actually, at its core, you're at work. so like there's this interesting thing where you realize as you explore yourself as an artist that some of the things that you want to do, if you nudge them just a little bit, will get into that center. They'll be something you can work on, and eventually, as an artist, I think you really start to develop that sense of overlap, and you start to really define and work on that center, right? Mm-hmm. But that's just one of us. We have multiple designers who are working on stuff at the office, and we have to kind of figure out what do we do and how do we do it. One of the big determinants is actually schedule. We can only do so many games in a year. We can only do so many projects. Doing more than about 2 to 3 Kickstarters or crowdfunders in a year is a lot. So we try to work out a schedule where we're able to do as much as we can do without overloading ourselves. And then that schedule is constantly overturned. Like we'll sign a license, which bumps things out, or one project will be bigger than we thought it was going to be, which bumps things out. And so we're constantly fighting the schedule and trying to fit in as much as we can. But ultimately, we're not driven by what project we think will be the most profitable. Mm-hmm. We're driven by what we think is a contribution to gaming and to the culture and to the industry that we think is sustainable. And that word sustainability is a lot of what drives Magpie, right? Like how do we build a sustainable working environment, and how do we build a sustainable presence in the market?
Absolutely. And so to get a little just into the weeds.
Sure.
In Avatar, I feel like you had a real interesting design choice of like, there are 2 Avatar properties, media shows, and they are not that similar in setting.
No. I mean, the first one is set in this kind of like, 1800s version of China, right? Yeah. Like where there's some technology, but it's pretty limited, and the world has been at war for a very long time, and like there's this one hero who is chosen to protect everybody and defeat the bad guy and save everything. It's like the Luke Skywalker story kind of thing, right? And then the second show is set in like 1910s Hong Kong. Like
post-industrial.
Like there's cars, there's like mechs, there's like, it's got this kind of vibe of being kind of multicultural. And the Avatar, this hero, is actually in a place where she can't fix the world's problems because the world isn't as simple anymore and has things like democracies, and those democracies have concerns about letting this superpowered individual make all their decisions, right? So yeah, these are really, really different. And that doesn't even count the novels, which happened before Aang Show, the comic books, which happened in between, the hints at setting other places. So yeah, like it was a big question when we went and talked to Paramount and Nickelodeon about, well, what is the game going to do? But actually, that one was pretty easy. Like for us, we looked at Avatar and said, the role-playing game has an opportunity to do a thing very few role-playing games get a chance to do, which is to offer a gateway for the property to become a franchise intellectual property at a bigger level. So right now, the Avatar verse, as it's called, is kind of narrow, right? It's got these 2 shows people know, and one of the shows was less popular than the other, right? But the world of Avatar is enormous. Like there's so many places that the show did not explore at all. And so what we put forward from the beginning was, hey, we want to have the game be set in 5 different eras. So you will choose when you play the game which of these 5 eras you want to work in. And it has this nice effect of each of the eras has a very different set of themes. So if you're in the Kyoshi era, which is the first era, it's like a 3 Kingdoms era where like there's warlords and bandits and like, heroes from small towns, and the world is kind of unformed, and, you're trying to, do the best you can as a hero in this kind of very, unstructured world. And Cora's era, which happens on the other side, the fifth era, is a world, like I said, where it's industrialized. There's these democracies, there's these treaties, and now you're working in a world that's very high context, where going to the police is like an option. Right? Like you go to the cops and be like, this guy's doing something bad, and then what if the cops are corrupt, or what if they're in on it, or what if the bad guy has a lot of political power? What do you do? And those are really different themes. And so what's fun? I just ran Avatar this weekend. What's fun is you lay out the 5 eras and you say, what kind of game do you want to play? And people almost always, like, there's only 1 or 2 areas that they're interested in because they're like, this is what I want. And then we start to build out their story from there. So we were really, really excited about that. And the question was always, was Paramount going to be on board with that, right? Or do they want us to somehow recreate Aang?
Yeah.
And we were really, really lucky. There's a woman named Joan Hilty she's one of the key editors inside Avatar Studios. But when we signed the contract, Avatar Studios hadn't been founded yet. Mike and Brian hadn't come back to Nickelodeon. So we were just working directly with consumer products. And Joan was the lead editor for consumer products. And there's no better advocate than Joan Hilty. She is incredible. Like, she got through stuff that I didn't think we were going to get done, got through paperwork that we're never going to get through. Like, she was such a fan of this license. I mean, that's why she went to work at Avatar Studios. She's such a fan that she really, knocked heads and broke down doors until we got the ability to do the setting at this level. And it has become then the first instance of this new brand, which is the Avatar Legends brand. So you'll notice it's Avatar Legends, the role-playing game. Avatar Legends is not the name of the game. The name of the game is Avatar Legends, the role-playing game, because Avatar Legends is the brand for the Avatarverse, like Star Wars or Star Trek. Avatar, you're going to see Avatar Legends as a name and a brand a lot more over the next couple of years. The difference is it takes them 5 years to make a movie, and it only takes us 3 years to make a role-playing game. So our stuff is coming out first, but there's a lot of stuff coming from Nickelodeon for the Avatarverse that's going to use this particular branding. Nice.
And so I was curious, you were talking about maybe getting into board games and what you wanted to look at and looking at narrative board games. So specifically, what board games are you looking at? What are you trying to emulate?
Yeah, so one of the things that we think is really interesting on the board game side is there's a wealth of games like Sleeping Gods or other games where the narrative is kind of baked into the game itself. Like, if you haven't played it, basically you'll have a board filled with islands, and you go to an island, and then the game will tell you, go read this thing in this book, and then there's a mystery and a story that unfolds, right? And that's pretty close to a role-playing game. It's not a lot different. And it's not the kind of game we'd ever make, in the sense that I think that what we want is to find that flexibility. That's what we love about role-playing games. But there's something going on there in terms of people trying to seek out these experiences where they experience a story, right?
Yeah.
The story is the focus. But we're also really interested in games like Root or coin games. Root is a game by one of our friends, Cole, over at Leader Games, Cole Worley. And in it, there's a woodland war between these animal factions, like the Erie dynasties, which are filled with birds, or the Marquise de Cat, who's the woodland invader. And it's really cute, but also murderous, because it's hardcore political. It's a metaphor for the Vietnam War. And these insurgents, there's mice and fox insurgents and the Woodland Alliance. It's cute, but it's deep, right? Yeah. And when you play the game, at the end of the game, you're that was a whole story. The cats being the cats stomping out the insurgency while the birds attacked them is a whole story. Yeah. And we think that emergent narrative, where they use board games that are not about playing fairly, they're not about strategy in the sense that everybody starts with the same resources and we see who wins based on your decisions. Yeah. They're instead, everybody starts at a different position, and we tell a story together through the conflicts and the events that happened. And that's also a role-playing game. So we're kind of interested in these different versions of telling stories. And I think that, we're going to try to find those right places where we think we have a unique perspective. But the other thing is, there's so many people making great board games right now. I mean, it's really it's a golden age for board games, in all seriousness. It has been for a while. That one of the big things we think a lot about is, are we really needed? Do we really have anything to say when there's so many people doing great work?
Absolutely. Yeah, the reason I asked is because I was like, oh, I feel like Leader Games is really pushing like narrative board games. Like they are, I think, the one at like the forefront of that. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned the coin games, which are from GMT.
Yeah.
Those are war games, right? So one of my favorites is called Fire in the Lake, which is based on the book about Vietnam called Fire in the Lake. And like, I just got it out this last week from my stepdad, who's a history professor who over at CNM had taught the Vietnam class. And as we laid it out, I was like, look at how it engages you in all this history here, right? And why those games are so interesting is that every player is taking on the role of a different faction. So someone's playing the Viet Cong, someone's playing the North Vietnamese army. And as you interact with each other, those interactions make sense. And if you're like, oh, I see why the North Vietnamese army would do the things they did based on the incentives and the structures of this system. Yeah. And for me, that's something really special, not just for teaching, but for learning, right? For experiencing these different perspectives. There's a really beautiful book by Tan Yen called Games, Agency as Art. And his theory is that music encodes an emotion. Like we listen to music and we're like, oh, this emotion, this feeling I have, or movies encode a narrative. Like here's a story, but you can pop it in and watch whenever you want. Games, in his mind, encode an agency. Like if you're playing chess, you're playing the commander moving these pieces around the board. But imagine a game of chess where before you moved, you had to roll a die to see if your piece listened to you. Well, that's a very different kind of agency. That's the agency of a king not really in command of his kingdom. Yeah. And so I think it's a fascinating idea about encoding agency so that when you play a game, you learn and experience an agency from a different perspective. And then later you can pull that agency off the shelf and think about, when I was playing Call of Cthulhu and I had to do these investigations and they seemed at all, at all odds, because we had talked earlier about you playing Call of Cthulhu. Well, it's a little weird. You ended up as a journalist, right? As somebody who's like trying to get to the truth.
It's a lot easier than it is in Call of Cthulhu.
Well, yeah. Right, yeah. Well, but that's the thing, right? Is that Call of Cthulhu gives you an agency, a way of thinking about what questions would I ask? Who would I talk to? What would the stakes of these conflicts be? What would I do when I get an answer that doesn't make sense? Would I dig in deeper or do I walk away? And that's what that game can teach us. And you can't see, if you're listening to the podcast, the like many bunny ears I'm making around. It's like because you don't learn it, right? In the sense you're not like, yes, I have taken the Call of Cthulhu college course and I now know how to ask questions about elder gods. It's instead that there's a part of you that's changed by that. And it becomes a capacity that you build inside yourself.
Yeah. I mean, going back to our pre-podcast conversation, like I've always been really into like horror RPGs. And part of that is like, oh, it is fun and kind of relieving of stress to play in these situations that are essentially safe, right? While in the moment they might like bring up emotion and stuff, it is fun to think about these like horrible situations and be like, what would I do?
What would I do?
Is that effective? But it is also, I think, like a very safe place to experience those emotions. And I think you can apply that to like horror films in general. Like there's a reason people enjoy them. But
well, I mean, I think there's a reason that women enjoy them. There's a reason that women like true crime podcasts. And there's this thing of like, there's this overhang of violence, right, throughout our society directed at women. And when we look at like horror films and true crime, and it's like, okay, I know as a woman that exists. So I'm engaging it, but I'm engaging it in a safe space, right? And so for me as a person of color, I have often found that urban fantasy does a similar thing, right? Like, I want to deal with questions of race and gender and power, but sometimes it's kind of a bummer to be like, okay, so this game is about the race riots. Like, well, it's kind of like a lot, right? But in urban fantasy, there's this thing of like, oh, I'm a vampire, and there are these elder vampires that are like keeping us down, and like, how do I navigate that? Like, I had this like really like lightning bolt moment where I was like, oh my God, that's just being a person of color in society is navigating power. And I want to play with those ideas, but I don't want to play with those ideas. I want to play with ideas that are adjacent or close, right? And so I think that there's definitely a thing where a lot of power fantasy and role-playing games, like I'm a wizard and I go and kill these goblins and take their stuff. it doesn't necessarily resonate a lot with women and people of color. One of the reasons we're so passionate about bringing new games is because we think there's a lot of other experiences that are worth experiencing, and that will appeal and grow that audience by giving them new things to experience that are maybe not what you would expect, right? And so when you're a Latino and you're playing Cartel and half the game's in Spanish and you're kind of dealing with this sort of telenovela melodrama, right? You're like, I know this. Like, I've seen this. I know how to play this. And it's speaking to me in a way that is true to my culture and my experiences and the stories that make sense to me. That's a certain kind of power that you have within that game, but it's also a certain kind of vulnerability because it's hitting you where you are, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things of making art in the role-playing game sense is to give people an opportunity to play with those signifiers and learn those agencies and experience those emotions, but then have a door they can close that's like, okay, cool, I'm done. And even if it sticks with you and you're kind of haunted by it, you're like, but this isn't my real life, right? And that's why, lots of different, when you look at the science of games, it's like the kind of games humans play is really unique, right? Like that we're willing to step into another world and pretend to be somebody we're not in order to have those experiences is a really uplifting and exciting part of being human, right?
To kind of circle back to if you are a person who has played D&D or Call of Cthulhu and you don't know about how to get into these indie games or how to try something new, like what would be your advice?
Well, I mean, first of all, if that's where you are, where you've tried one of the sort of more mainstream games and you're looking for new stuff, like you are in luck. There has been more awesome, not mainstream stuff that's very available in the last 5 years than probably the last 50. Like it's a golden age of getting involved with stuff. What I will say is probably a little surprising in that I think there's a lot of Magpie's products that are really, really great for new role players. Everything from like Zombie World, where it's a game in a box, like you don't have to read a big manual to play Zombie World, to like Avatar, where if you know the Avatar world, there's a lot of reasons to play. The number one thing I tell people actually is for you to tell me what kind of fiction, what kind of experience you love. Gotcha. So like if we were talking outside the podcast and you said, I love horror, I'd be like, okay, look, you got to try Dread, which is an amazing game where you use a Jenga tower to decide if your character lives or dies. Yeah. You should play Bluebeard's Bride, which is one of our games. It's a feminine horror game in which you explore a haunted mansion, right? But you also should look at something like Vaesen, which is a game from Free League, in which you are a Nordic investigator of these Nordic monsters, right? And like it's a little bit more in the monster hunting genre, but it's also a little horror and which one of those things speaks to you? Because I think that you really have to figure out, like, are you a sci-fi person? Are you a fantasy person? Are you an urban fantasy person? And find games that speak to that, because it's really hard to play a game that you don't care about, right? Like it takes a lot of time and energy and effort to do it.
I mean, I think each of those, to put a little bit of my own philosophy in the mix, I think each of those genres has their own like nouns and verbs.
Oh, it's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
And so I think it can be really hard for me, like I was a kid who grew up in sci-fi, so it was very easy to go to Call of Cthulhu, which uses a lot of sci-fi nouns and verbs. Yeah. And I had a much harder time going to D&D when that's what my friends wanted to do, because I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. Even though what you're doing is pretty essentially the same. Because you don't know the nouns and verbs, it can feel much harder. And you, unlike your friends, have to go through this like transcribing process of like, okay, so this is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I have a partner who was at the convention with me this weekend, and she's not like a sci-fi person or a fantasy person. She really likes things that have relationships. And so I was like, oh, we should play Sagas of the Icelanders. And Sagas of the Icelanders is a game about Vikings. And it's not about like raiding and like fighting the British and doing stuff, although that could be cool. Instead, it's about like the home life of Viking people on the frontier in Iceland. And so like, okay, so the man of the house is like, he's struggling because he broke his leg last year. And so he can't do as much in the fields. So they had to hire this guy who's a wanderer, but he like wants to marry his daughter, and the daughter doesn't want to marry him. Right. And so like to somebody who wants to go out and kill goblins, you're like, why would I play this game? This sounds awful. Sounds like a soap opera. But for my partner, she was like, there's exactly what yes, like that is exactly what I want, right? And so like, yeah, it's nouns and verbs, but I think it's also what I think of as like the sizzle, like where's the heat coming from this game, right? And when you're like, if you're a person who like loves Sex in the City and reads, novels about people and their relationships, when you hear about this Viking society and like all of its ins and outs and nuances, and these two kids are getting married and blah 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 blah, you're like, that's the sizzle, that's the heat, right? And I think it's very much true that if you're playing a horror game and I tell you, yeah, you're going to go into this haunted mansion and there's these rooms and you open the doors and you're like, yes, 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 right? But if you're not a horror fan, that all sounds like no, no, no. Like I'm not interested, right? So I think that like when I say that, there's a lot of different products out there. It's because I think it's kind of a golden age for RPGs. But I think for us, the games that we really try to focus on making available to people, obviously Avatar is a big one because there's a lot of people like if you like Avatar, it's going to give you an incredible experience. And we even have a starter set. It's just $25 that gives you all the dice you would need to play, character sheets, everything in one package. Like I said, Zombie World is an incredible game to start with because it comes in a box, right? And we have other games where, if you're looking for a game about teenage superheroes, like if that's you love Teen Titans and Young Justice, you're gonna love Masks: A New Generation. If you like Breaking Bad, like I do, as an Albuquerque, as a Burqueño, but also maybe a little concerned that Breaking Bad is like mostly about white people, then Cartel is going to be the perfect game for you because it's Breaking Bad but set in Mexico, right? And so I think that like doing that work, like our hope as a company is we've given you a dozen different on-ramps. And and with the understanding that not every on-ramp is going to be for every person.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you like coming onto the podcast and taking time to like talk. I could truly go on forever.
That's great. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I think it's been it's so funny, right? Because one of the things we talk about a lot is that we're very much a New Mexican company. Like 80% of our workforce is here in Albuquerque. The people who don't live here and work here are usually people who live in the Netherlands or Mexico. Like they live in other countries. We get people to move here all the time when we hire because it's so important to us to have them here. And at the same time, New Mexico is small. There's not a big role-playing game community here, and so a lot of the conventions we go to other places, a lot of the packages we ship go to other places. We probably ship more packages to other countries than we do within New Mexico. But we are so excited to introduce New Mexicans to role-playing whenever we can. So we're really, really excited to be here, and I hope that some folks go to our website, magpiegames.com, check it out, look for our Kickstarter projects, and just generally kind of like try out what we do, because it's one of the things I am most proud of as a kid who grew up, in Nob Hill and went to Albuquerque High School and spent my whole life here, as a kid, is that one of the largest role-playing game companies in the world is based here in Albuquerque. If you had told me that when I was a kid, I wouldn't have believed you. So there's something really for me that I'm proud of what Magpie Games is, and that it is a Burqueño role-playing game institution, and that for us is really important.